on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, or NIDLR, who is sponsoring this presentation through our Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Employment for Persons with Physical Disabilities, with Dr. Alan Heineman as the principal investigator. Our speaker today is Wendy Strobel Gower, who is the Thomas P. Golden Director of Disability Inclusive Workplaces and Employer Fee-for-Service Initiatives at Cornell University's K. Lisa Yang and Hock E. Institute on Employment and Disability in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations. Wendy's professional work focuses on interpreting disability laws and regulations for application to workplace policy and practice, and on developing and testing innovative approaches to culture change in organizations as it relates to inclusion of people with disabilities. Wendy's also the project director for the Northeast ADA Center, which is funded by NIDLR, and she's the co-director of the Employer Assistance and Resource Network, which is funded by the Office of Disability Employment Policy. Wendy holds a master's degree in Rehabilitation Counseling from the Medical College of Virginia at Virginia Commonwealth, VCU. So please help me in welcoming Wendy Strobel Gower.
Hi, everyone. Very nice to be here with you today. As Linda said, we're going to talk about the ADA a little bit. This is our grant funding statement. I won't make you listen to it. And this is the contact information for the ADA centers. We are a national network. So this 800 number will connect you to an ADA center where you can get toll-free confidential technical assistance on the Americans with Disabilities Act and other disability issues just by calling that number. So that's an easy way to follow up after the conference if you still have questions. So our plan for today, we're going to talk about what the ADA is and what it attempts to help people to do. And then we're going to talk about a few different settings. We're going to talk about employment, we're going to talk about healthcare access, and we're going to talk about community participation. Chris said that he would help us with questions. So if you have questions for me, put them in the chat, and we'll stop at the break for each section and we can go through some of your questions. As I told everybody before we started, my expertise really lays in Title I and employment issues, but I know the basics for the other areas, and I know who to call, right, if we need help. So we are going to do our best. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was just a little bit about disability inclusion. It's kind of a strange term for people who don't work in this field or, live with or love someone who has a disability. But really the goal of inclusion is to make sure that our communities, our workplaces, our services work for everyone. So there's 3 quotes here that I wanted to share. It's really about transformation of systems, including physical spaces and policies and practices and attitudes that really need to change and adapt to make sure that everyone is welcome. So the first, inclusion is not a strategy to help people fit into the systems and structures which exist in our societies. It's about transforming those systems and structures to make them better for everyone. The second, it's not about adding people in after the fact. It's about planning for differences up front. And then the third is it's being included in life, participating in day-to-day activities as a member of the community. So you will see why these particular quotes are so important in kind of setting the stage as we go through some of the slides today. Traditionally, people with disabilities have been an afterthought in our communities and our workplaces and our services. So this will work for people who, who walk, who communicate regularly. We just don't always think about what are some other ways that people may need access. So those are the things we're going to talk about today. So what's the ADA, right? That's the big essential question. The heart of the matter is non-discrimination. The ADA is a non-discrimination law. It focuses on providing equal opportunity for everyone. And if you remember one thing, this is the one thing that you should remember from today. Who has rights under the ADA? So to be protected by the ADA, you have to have a disability, or you can have a record of having a disability. So let's say you went into the hospital when you were 15 for a mental health condition, and the person who is interviewing you knows about that experience and would then bring it up or use that as a reason not to hire you. You would be protected by the ADA. And it also covers people who are regarded as having a disability. And that means that because of someone's perception of you, they treat you like you have a disability, and that results in some disparate treatment, some opportunity that you weren't able to take advantage of because of the assumption they made about your disability. That happens to people who have like facial deformities, people who may act outside of whatever the norm is considered. But it does happen. It also covers people who have an association with a person with a disability. Let's say my son is autistic, and let's say that someone decided not to hire me because they were worried I would take too much time off in support of my son. So I would also be protected. For disability, it's a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. When they passed the ADA Amendments Act, they also clarified major life activities included major bodily functions. So it would automatically cover people who have an endocrine system dysfunction or reproductive system dysfunction. Just because a lot of the focus before the ADA Amendments Act was passed was not on whether discrimination occurred, but rather it was on whether or not a person had a disability. So they said, wait, this is too hard. It shouldn't be this high of a bar to be acknowledged that you're a person with a disability and therefore eligible for protection. So they really took a lot of time to clarify what that definition meant when they passed the ADA Amendments Act. All right. There are 5 titles of the ADA. The first title is on employment. So that's work, right? And it applies to both employers who have 15 or more employees and employees with disabilities and job applicants with disabilities. Title 2 is state and local government programs and services. Title 3 is places of public accommodation, stores, restaurants, hotels, all the places in our community that are private businesses that offer services to community members. Title 4 is telecommunications. That created the relay system in the United States. I don't know if you've ever used that, but let's say that you have a client or a customer or a patient, whoever you see, that is deaf. He may use the relay system to call you, which allows an operator who can either interpret ASL signs, or read captioning from a screen to communicate with someone who speaks. And Title 5 covers things, miscellaneous things. So protection from retaliation. It sets limits for lawsuits and things like that. That's not the fun one. So just to get us started, what gets in the way of community participation? There are a lot of things. Transportation access is not equal for people with disability, either in the public transportation system, although they do have requirements, or in private transportation, things like Uber and Lyft. There's a lot of discussion right now. How do we make those accessible? But a lot of people with disabilities don't have the same access to transportation within communities. Physical access to and in community locations. Does the local restaurant have stairs? Is the door wide enough for a wheelchair? Do they have, menus that people can read if they can't see? Things like that. Or do they have a waiter who understands that they have an obligation to then read the menu to someone? A lot of facilities lack equipment and tools to support access. This is particularly true in the healthcare industry, sorry to say. And then there's a lot of communication barriers as well. And finally, there's stigma and assumptions about disability. The automatic assumption that disability means a person can't interact in a certain way or shouldn't interact in a certain way, that just are the attitudinal barriers that can really create problems for people with disabilities when they're trying to access the community, can be a big problem. And really the big question that people with disabilities ask themselves is, am I welcome here? If you can't get into a place, there's no accessible route for you. If you can't get accommodations, or someone doesn't say, ask me if you need an accommodation, you don't really feel like you fit. And when you're seeking to connect to your community, right, that is a huge barrier for people. Because they don't feel like they're welcome. They try to go to a local community event and they can't get in. They try to register for a class and none of the videos are accessible, or they can't get into the online platform that's being used. There's all kinds of ways you can not get access to stuff. But sometimes just opening that door and saying, if you need an accommodation, please call this person, and they will actually do something to follow up on that request, is a great first step. All right, I don't see any questions yet, Chris, so I'm going to go on to talk about employment stuff. So I wanted to start with this slide because, as I mentioned, that attitudes and stigma and assumptions about people with disability really can get in the way of living your life if you have a disability. How many of you, well, I can't ask you this because I can't see you, have ever heard of ableism? Ableism is really the idea that, I'm going to just tell my computer not to restart. I'll tell it to do it in 4 hours. Okay. All right. Hopefully that works. Ableism is a thing that a lot of people with disabilities really struggle with. It's the idea that if you have a disability, then you can't do, right? It's all of the assumptions that we make about disability. I was looking for a good definition because I think it is really important. And of course, I forgot to write it down. So I'm just looking to see if I can find it real quick. No, I can't find a good one. So I'm going to find one and put it in chat in a little bit. But it's the idea that if you're able-bodied, then you can do everything that everyone else can do. If you are not able-bodied, then you are automatically helpless or less than or can't do. So it creates a lot of barriers for people with disabilities who are just trying to kind of get through their day. And it's almost equivalent to like racism. So when you're racist, you have all these ideas about who Black people are and what they can do and what they can't do. And it's kind of that applied to disability. And it's you know, just like any other systemic ism, it's a huge barrier to people as they try to live their daily lives. I want to talk a little bit about the power of assumptions, especially as it relates to work. So I was just working on something for EARN, and we were saying how important it is to standardize expectations and job descriptions for people with disabilities, right? Or for all employees as they come in to interview for a position. And you would think, well, of course that's standardized. The manager is going to say the same thing to everyone because that's the job. But the problem is when the manager sees that someone has a disability, they think automatically, well, he can't do that job, so I'm not going to tell him about those parts of the job. And then it won't look like we're automatically discriminating against him or her who applied to the position. So the assumptions that the manager make immediately creates barriers, right? You don't get the full picture, so you can't reply in the interview to the full range of expectations for the position. You can't contradict any of the things that the manager might be thinking, right? Because no one voiced those things. So how can you defend yourself? And let me just give you an example. When I was 30, and this was a long time ago, I got sick and I went to my manager. I was a high performer, always had been. And I went to my manager and I said, I just wanted you to know that I'm going through some medical things and they're not sure what's wrong, but I'm going to be missing a little bit of time because I have to go to doctors and get tests and things like that. And she said to me, I guess we can't give you the hard jobs anymore. And I'm like, wait a minute. What changed from yesterday to today, other than your assumption about my ability to do the work I'd always done in the way I'd always done it, right? So that is an excellent example of the power of assumptions. It changes what you think someone's capable of, so it changes their access to opportunity to prove to you they can do it. I hope that makes sense. And I also want to talk about disability comfort and our perception of normal. And you see in the image here, one cow is hanging upside down in a tree, and the other is standing on the ground. And the upside down cow says, define normal, right? A lot of times what people with disabilities hear when they apply for positions is, he just won't fit here. Or I don't think he's going to get along with everyone on the team, or I can't see him keeping up with all the stress that we have. And so it's really more about what you perceive to be fitting or normal or okay, and what you think other people are going to be okay with that's getting in the way of that hire, right? It's not anything other than that. So we oftentimes, I know when we do the Employer Assistance Resource Network, EARN, is all about teaching managers disability inclusion. We did a whole page on disability etiquette and interaction, right? So that people understand that people are people. And while they may approach the world a little differently, they might not look you in the eye, or they may communicate differently, or they may greet you differently, or they may be standing or sitting in a different apparatus or way than you are sitting or standing. People are people, and you just need to treat people like adults. Act like it's okay if you make a mistake, because it is, so you can get past some of that awkwardness that gets in the way of being even willing to hire people with disabilities, let alone actually doing it. All right, I hope that makes sense. Okay. The main point of Title I is non-discrimination in hiring. One thing that we always tell employers is your organization can and should hire the most qualified candidate for the position. That is never been contested in any aspect of the ADA. The ADA is not about affirmative action. So there's no quotas for hiring people who are different. It is merely a law that's equal opportunity, right? So yeah, hire the best person for the job. The important thing here, though, don't assume it can't be a person with a disability, right? So this means that you have to adjust your interview questions to be like, how are you going to succeed? How are you going to make this job your own? How would you handle this situation? So that people can expand on and tell you about how they approach work. Because for a lot of people with disabilities, it might be different, but difference is good, right? Because that's where we find efficiency. I heard a story the other day from a guy in a really large financial company, and he has people with disabilities in his department. And they were doing something very complex and complicated, looking for errors as they were about to release a new technology to the company. So this person asked to see the underlying code. because he found an error. He couldn't figure out why it was happening. He asked to see the underlying code so he could figure out why it was happening, and then created a standard practice for the department to include the analysis of that code to make fixing errors quicker and easier for the department that was building the technology. So difference is good, right? People approach a situation differently. They figure out their best way, and then the standard best way gets better. All right, so the important question in any interview is, can you perform the essential functions of a job with or without a reasonable accommodation? That's a yes or no question. You can't ask any other questions that are likely to elicit disability information. So you have to be very careful that your hiring managers know and understand that. The main question that you should ask is, how do you plan to be effective in this role, right? That's what's important. Any new employee, you want to know that they're going to be good at it, and you want them to tell you how they're going to be good at it. So that's always the question we encourage people to ask. Here's some examples of illegal questions. Do you have a disability that would make this job difficult? How many days were you sick last year? Have you ever been treated for mental health problems? Or what prescription drugs are you currently taking? Never ask these questions. They are bad questions. I probably shouldn't have put them in your heads. But any accommodation request starts with disclosure. And it usually is some form of, because of X medical condition or disability, I'm having trouble with Y job duty. It could be, I'm sorry, I had to leave the meeting earlier. I had to take some insulin to balance my blood sugar. So while not a very obvious, I'm going to disclose my disability to you right now, it includes the elements of, because of X medical condition or disability, I'm having trouble with Y job duty. So if someone were to say I had to adjust my insulin, that's disclosure. If they said, wow, I'm really tired today because my allergies are kicking in, that's just complaining. And so your manager should know and understand how to recognize disability disclosure, because once someone does this, they tie a medical condition or a disability to a job duty, then something needs to happen within your organization. And usually that's a request for a reasonable accommodation, and that process needs to be initiated. An accommodation is any change in the work environment or in the way things are customarily done that enables an individual with a disability to enjoy equal employment opportunities. Straight from the law, very exciting definition. So basically, it's another way to approach work. So if most people drive between your locations in a car, that is one way to do it. If someone who can't drive a car takes a bus or a taxi or an Uber, that's another way to do it. So really, the job task isn't driving, it's travel, right? But making that distinction allows for these reasonable accommodations where people can choose what works for them in doing what's important to you as the employer. Equal opportunity employment opportunities, that's the idea that any benefits or privileges you offer to your employees, a gym, training, that everyone can get access to it. So that's an important part of the law, right? So if you have a wellness program and everyone can go to the gym on site, you also have to have wellness equipment that people with disabilities can use, or offer classes that are accessible to them. So that's the important part of that, part of the definition. I want to talk a little bit about the availability of accommodations, because it's really at 3 times. It's during the application process, it's performing the essential functions of the position, so actually doing the job, and then enjoying those equal benefits and privileges. But they all matter. Like, the application process is a thing you have to accommodate. The accommodation has to work. It only has to reduce employment-related barriers. So if someone says, I can't find transportation to get to work, we don't have to fix that. I'm sorry that's happening, and we can talk about some strategies that might work, but the employer doesn't have to fix that, okay? They don't have to provide wheelchairs, scooters, things like that. No personal devices are required. People who are covered under regarded as are not titled to accommodations because they don't really have disabilities. People are just treating them like they do, but they don't have a disability. So no accommodations for them. And employers are not prevented from providing extra accommodations. That is something that employers can choose to do. For example, let's say that you don't have a work from home policy or a flexible workplace policy. Someone with a disability said, I need to work from home. And it's difficult for you. It's like not something that you can just do as a matter of course. You could say, I'm sorry, this position requires presence in the workplace. If someone can't do the essential functions, they're not qualified. But you could say, sure, we can make that work. And here's how we're going to do that. That's your choice. Okay. So things that are usually reasonable, making modifications to increase facility accessibility, ramps, entry buttons, things like that. Job restructuring to remove marginal job functions or jobs that aren't the primary reason for the job to exist. Flexible scheduling, acquiring new equipment, let's say a screen reader or larger monitors, things like that. Providing qualified readers or interpreters. And then modification of application and testing procedures and training materials, which means like captioning on your training videos and things like that. Things that aren't generally reasonable, employers never have to remove essential job functions. They don't have to lower production standards. If you have a uniformly applied production standards that applies to everyone, say nurses have to deliver X amount of patient medications during their shift, that can stay. No personal use items. You never have to change someone's supervisor. That being said, you may have to ask a supervisor to change the way that they interact with a person. So instead of drive-by assignments where I run by Chris's office and I say, Chris, I need you to do X, Y, Z and run away, I may have to send an email to Chris, right? And so that he has that in a written form so that he hears it. Excusing violations of uniformly applied conduct rules, never something you'll have to do. And then you don't have to put in place accommodations that cause an undue hardship. So anything that would either be prohibitively expensive, which is a very high bar, or would cause disruptions in the way that you do business. Okay, so the example I gave you of in-person position that required presence, let's say they were a customer service rep who actually waited on customers who came into your shop. Making that change because they physically interact with people in the workplace could present an undue administrative burden because it changes the way that you operate. Always check with a lawyer before you have a manager who randomly decides what's okay and what's not okay, or at least HR, because they'll check with the lawyer. There's an interactive discussion that happens after someone asks for a reasonable accommodation. There's really a few things you need to know. What part of your job are you having difficulty with because of your disability? What are the tasks that are difficult for you? And do you have any recommendations for potential solutions? So we're looking at the functional limitations that are related to disabilities, right? So what gets in the way of you doing this job task? Is it that your hands hurt? Is it that you can't stand that long? So really looking at the functional limitation the person is experiencing and how it impacts their job. Asking people for potential solutions is honestly just a time saver. A lot of people with disabilities have accommodated themselves for a long time, where they accommodate themselves in other environments. Those same solutions may work at work. So it's always good to ask and see if that helps you. The goal is to have a civil dialogue that leads to the identification of an effective solution to the barriers to completion of an essential function. And I say this because oftentimes people line up on sides, like I'm asking for something, the manager wants to win, the employee wants to win by getting what he wants, the manager wants to win by doing exactly what he wants, and it can get a little contentious. So I just want you to remember that really the goal is a civil dialogue. You want to reach a mutually beneficial decision that works for the person to do the job that you want them to do and do it well. And that saves us hiring costs, it saves us training costs. And so that's really kind of the ideal. All right, any employment questions?
Looks like there are a question that, so who is responsible for paying for the accommodation?
The employer is responsible for paying for the accommodation, right? So that's one thing I think that a lot of employers don't understand. First off, let me assure you that most accommodations aren't prohibitively expensive. There are some software packages that will cost you money, but most accommodations can be made for under $500, okay? But it is the employer who's in charge of putting those accommodations in place. In some cases, if the person is working with a vocational rehabilitation agency, they can help you problem solve how you might get that covered. I know I personally in an employment provider role have gotten a bank to donate a used money counting machine because the employer couldn't afford it, but it was a really good solution for the person to count all this money she had to count. So, you know, people can be creative, but it's the employer's responsibility. And that also gives the employer a lot of control over what gets put into place. The employer always decides, they always get the final say as to what gets put into place, but the solution does have to work. So the employer pays, it gives them more control, which is a good thing, and it's usually not that expensive.
Great, thank you. I had an additional question. You mentioned kind of the regarded as prong as something that, you know, people wouldn't be entitled to an accommodation with that. Is that a legal definition or a medical definition? I think sometimes like in our notes we might write something, but you know, what would fall under kind of a regarded as?
Yeah, so regarded as is part of the legal definition from the ADA regs. So it is very much codified. If you are making a note in as a manager or an employer in your files, never say, I think he might have a disability, or this may be related to a disability issue, because for sure, that is not a good thing to do. You know, we didn't get into this, but the one thing we always say is if you ever are working with someone, you suspect that the problem with their performance is because of a disability issue, you should focus very much on concrete events. Yesterday in the meeting, you raised your voice at Tom and seemed upset. What can you tell me about this situation and how can we help you move past it, right? So you may in your head be thinking, oh, I wonder if it's a mental illness. But if you write that down, then you're putting yourself at risk. So focus on the concrete and focus on solutions. That question of, you know, what can you tell me about it and how can you help me? Those are invitations to then identify, you know, disclose your disability and ask for an accommodation, but we've never put it out there that we believe the person has a disability. So don't document your speculations, I guess is the short answer.
Okay. Great. Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, are we ready for healthcare? All right, I'm going to take that as a yes. First, let me tell you a little bit about healthcare and people with disabilities and why it's so important for people with disabilities. People with disabilities are more likely to have heart disease. They're more likely to have stroke, diabetes, cancer, more likely to be obese. They get less exercise. They are more likely to have secondary chronic condition. They have more days of pain, depression, anxiety, and sleeplessness, and less energy than people without activity limitations. Oftentimes, that increased emotional distress is not directly related to the disability, but rather from the environmental barriers that reduce an individual's activity. So I recently joined a gym. I did not have to worry about whether I could get into the gym, whether the gym had equipment that I could use. whether I could, scan my little card when I go into the gym. For people with disabilities, they have to make those decisions and check on all of those things every time they look for a new destination, right? So it creates a lot of emotional labor, a lot of physical labor, and it's not always ideal. There are places that will say, yeah, we're fully accessible. And you get there and there's a stare because people don't notice things like that when there's an activity limitation. So, a lot of this reduced activity has to do with the reduced access. So just to put that out there. People with disabilities lag behind in accessing and being served by healthcare providers. And then healthcare practitioners often lack knowledge regarding accessible medical equipment, even though that's in the law, right? So one thing to know, whether you're public or private, if you serve the public in some way, you are probably covered by the ADA. Title II of the ADA again applies to state and local government and other public entities. So publicly funded hospitals would fall under Title II. If you are a privately funded hospital or business, then you are a public accommodation and you are covered under Title III. Okay, a lot of the rules for Title II and Title III are very similar. So we're not going to go through them separately. We're just going to talk about them generally. But you probably have obligations under the ADA to provide access to people with disabilities. So just to go over some of the basics here, physical accessibility makes it possible for a person using a wheelchair or other mobility aid to get into a building and then to access all the parts of it that the public accesses. If you are a Title II or a Title III entity, you have to comply with the relevant physical access requirements under each title of the ADA. If you want to know what those are, you should definitely call the ADA centers. I have one person who knows every code known to man. I am not that girl. But they can give you a good overview if you call. Any new construction or alterations have to apply with these ADA standards for accessible design. And existing facilities have to progress over time towards full compliance with these standards. You'll see a lot of times that hospitals won't have adjustable exam tables in every room that they offer. They offer it in a few, right? And then when they get new equipment, they add a few more. So that's kind of the example of that progression. There are standards for diagnostic equipment. It's been really problematic for people with disabilities. A lot of times when they did this one healthcare study that was super well done. I wish I had the reference right at my fingertips. I can send that to Linda and she can share that with you guys if you're interested. But they found that a lot of people with disabilities would go into a hospital facility or a physician in their wheelchair and need to get examined for something that they should definitely be on an exam table for. But the doctor would say, because they didn't know how to or want to transfer them, I'll just examine you in your wheelchair. And they're not getting that same quality of care because of those reasons. So as you can see, there are now these standards, access standards for diagnostic equipment. The Access Board has lots of information on those if you want more information on those. Again, not an expert. One thing I do know something about is effective communication. Healthcare providers have to ensure that people who are deaf, people with speech impairments, have equally effective accommodation than others. Okay, so if your standard practice is to give someone a follow-up sheet on a piece of paper that says, here's your follow-up care plan, and that's all you do, people who are blind can't see that plan ever. They're not going to be able to read it. So are you giving that in an accessible electronic format? Are you recording it for them? There's more than one way to do it, but are you giving it to them in a way where they have the same access to it later on? For someone who's deaf, Are you making sure that if you're having a complex conversation with them about a diagnosis or a treatment plan, that they have someone there who speaks their language to translate all of the complexity of what it is you're trying to communicate? That's not a family member who has a vested interest, in what they communicate to the person. That is equal access, right? My doctor having a verbal conversation with me works for me because I can hear. A doctor having a verbal conversation with someone who is deaf is not the same. Writing notes back and forth is not the same as that verbal communication. And that is why sign language interpreters are so important, in hospital systems and doctor's offices, things like that. And yeah, the doctor's office or the hospital system pays for that. That is not a cost or even something that the patient should have to organize. That's all on the provider to do so. You should always consult with the individual to determine what works. So I'm deaf and I make an appointment with my doctor's office and I say I'm deaf, so I'm just getting a vaccine, so I shouldn't need a sign language interpreter. Or since we're talking about a treatment plan, I want to make sure I understand I'm going to need a sign language interpreter, or a CART or whatever it is that works for them. And CART is computer aided real-time translation. It's basically if someone types everything that you say so the other person can read it. But you have to ask that question, right? Some people who speak ASL don't read written English. That's not their language. Where some people who are deaf don't sign because they didn't learn it and it's not their language. So you have to ask the question. A healthcare provider has to consider the length and complexity of the communication that they're having with the person. And I gave you some examples of that all through this little talk. I want to talk about service animals. People love to talk about service animals. It's one of the most confusing things, I think, for people. And service animals in healthcare facilities is an especially popular topic because you can't bring that dog in here, right? It's a dirty dog and he's not allowed in here. So a service animal is a dog. There's one exception for a miniature horse. And these are about dog size, and people like them because they live a lot longer than dogs do. So they have a longer service length, okay? That is trained to perform a specific task for a person with a disability. That animal has to be permitted to accompany their handler wherever the public is allowed to go. Okay, so that means they can go to the restroom and they can go to the cafeteria and they can go in patient rooms and they can go in exam rooms. If the public is restricted, then the dog can't go. And they can't go into sterile fields. Like you wouldn't have someone take their service animal into a surgery, obviously, or a burn unit, or any place where there's a sterile environment being maintained. One thing you have to know is that a service animal has to be under the control of its handler at all times. So if you have a dog in your hospital that is playing with other people, barking at other people, whatever, or sniffing around the tables in the cafeteria, that's not all right. And you can say, either get your animal under control or you have to take them out. Then, of course, you have to welcome the person back in without their animal if you do kick out their service animal. When it's not clear what task a service animal performs, you can ask two questions, okay? Is the animal a service animal needed because of a disability? Yes or no? What task or work has the animal been trained to perform? And there are a lot of jobs that service animals do. It's not just, hearing dogs and sighted guides. We made a toolkit, and I put the link to the toolkit in here. You can read all the information about service animals and see some examples. So if you're still curious about service animals, you should read that. I want to talk about reasonable modification. Reasonable modification is kind of the backbone of Title II and Title III. And what it says is you have to modify your policies and practices and procedures to avoid discrimination against a person with a disability. Things like letting a service animal comes in, providing assistance with forms if it's not available in an accessible format. You don't normally do it, but you didn't give it to the person in a way that they could do it independently, so you have to help. Maybe allowing an aide to accompany someone to a course that you're offering at the hospital at no charge, right? So making sure that you're looking at your policy and practice and saying, I can change this to allow access to this person if that's what they need. You can't charge extra, so you can't say, well, you're bringing an aide, they got to pay too, right? So there can't be any additional costs that are passed on to the individual with disability, not for sign language interpreting, not for captioning, not for any of that stuff, okay? So no surcharges are allowed for disability-related accommodations. Here's a video, you can watch it. If you feel like it, you don't have to. We're not going to watch it now. Videos never work when I do them online. So I just wanted to share this with you so that you could watch it at your leisure. All right. Just briefly to go over some of the trends and why some of this stuff is so important. Healthcare providers often deny auxiliary aids and services, including sign language interpreters. We see a lot of lawsuits that effective communication was not provided for individuals who came into a medical facility. Inaccessible medical equipment and refusal to modify policies to ensure access. And then not providing services to a patient with HIV, which of course is not legal. We see a lot now around medication-assisted treatment, the MAT treatment for substance abuse. I can't treat you if you do that. That's the kind of the big new trend that we're seeing in healthcare. So that's my healthcare bit. Does anyone have any questions?
I don't see any questions active in the chat.
Okay.
I mean, I could say that one of the things that we see here so often on the inpatient side particularly is, as we're looking for discharge destinations for folks who have new disabilities, often they're old, or I shouldn't say they're old, but their home that they were at before that may have been accessible is no longer accessible given their level of function. That's just something that we experience so often. I don't know if there are tools or resources that we could offer patients that are having trouble navigating that.
Yeah, there are usually community resources. I think getting people connected to vocational rehabilitation after their injury is a really good idea. They may not be thinking about work right away, but a lot of times those community rehab providers and vocational rehabilitation providers can direct people to resources they might need in the community. Sometimes VR has people who can assist with home modification. But I think those connections to community supports are critical because there are, depending on the community, sometimes the local ADA centers will know of and can help you find those resources. So if you're having trouble connecting to resources in your community or in the communities that your patients are going back to, do reach out to the ADA center and say, how do I connect to the local VR agencies? Are there programs that offer home modifications? We are supposed to just answer questions on the ADA, but we get so many questions about disability, about other disability rights laws. So it's worth a shot. They may say, I'm sorry, I don't know, and connect you to an independent living center, which are great resources in local communities because they know all the resources available to the disability community. And they are really focused on community living. And a lot of communities have those. So even if you say, what's the independent living center in this person's neighborhood, that would be a great start. All right, I'm going to go on to community access. Community access is really about Title III, accessibility in public accommodations and commercial facilities. And we talked about this already. The key points for Title III are access to goods and services. Okay, so even if your store is not accessible, what are you doing to make sure that your customers can get access to the goods and services you offer? Curbside service, online order and delivery, what's it going to be? But you have to make sure people can get to what you offer. An equal opportunity to participate. Let's say that you're offering community swimming at your hotel. Everyone in the community should be able to participate in that. And that means a pool lift, right? Yeah, so everyone can get in. Access to the same services. If you are a stylist shop and you do manicures and pedicures and haircuts and things like that, people with disabilities need all those things too. So how are you going to make that happen? Again, if you're not physically accessible, will you do home service? Or is there another way that you can make that happen? Example, coming into a hospital or rehab facility to provide services on certain days. And also those physical accessibility requirements that we talked about earlier. So there are lots of different services covered under Title III. I'm not going to read all of these. But there's a few considerations that are really critical for community participation. Part of this is route mapping. So I know if you have a facility, you have to have a plan for the person to get from the parking lot on the shortest accessible route into your facility, right? You have to have thought through some of those route maps. If you're offering community activities, you have to do the same thing. Is there an accessible path of travel through this event for people who might not be walking? I think the question of, but is it accessible, is a really important one. And it goes back to those quotes that we shared at the beginning, right? That accessibility isn't an afterthought because at the last minute someone said, oh, I'm going to need a sign language interpreter. If you are offering a training event, if you are offering a community event, if you are offering a meet and greet, have those things set up and available in advance. Make sure that you're giving people a clear way to ask for those accommodations and a deadline. 10 days before the event, you have to have said, I need a sign language interpreter. I need cart. I need accessible materials. In a perfect world, every event would offer these things. You would just do it as a matter of course. But I realize and recognize the world is not a perfect place. We do, for the ADA centers, have a priority. Obviously, we offer CART, we offer ASL. Every webinar that we do for EARN, we have an ASL interpreter, we have captioning. If we don't, we get in so much trouble. You know, we get yelled at copiously because people expect it. And so in an ideal world, those things are automatically offered. People are automatically thinking through a route. People are automatically thinking through dietary options for a community meal that they're offering and giving people options. People are automatically saying, this is a scent-free environment. So people who have sensitivities to smells are not prohibited from coming in. You know, so just some of those standard practices. I can share, if people are interested, resources on planning accessible events, creating accessible documents, all of that kind of stuff with you. But there's certainly proactive steps that you can take to make sure that your community is welcoming and accessible and inclusive for people with disabilities. And I encourage you, and Chris, since you mentioned, you know, people who have new disabilities and are going back into their communities, help them think about how are you going to continue to engage in your community? Here are some of the transportation options in your area. What are the things you think might work? What do we need training on to get you to be able to use those? Because as you transition people out of a facility, if they can continue to be part of their communities, they're gonna get better faster, they're gonna feel better faster, and they aren't going to have to disengage and then re-engage, right? They can stay engaged with the friends and the family that they have now, in the community that they have now. And I just wanted us to think about as we close, some of the mental and emotional load on people with disabilities as they seek to engage in the community, as they seek to engage in work, all of the things that they have to worry about that many people don't. You know, one of my friends has to take a trip for work, and so she's like, okay, well, I can't carry my bag into the airport because I have a wheelchair, and how am I going to get it there? Well, there's no curbside service at the airport, so I can't do that. So if I stay overnight in this hotel and they have a shuttle, then I can do that, but the shuttle's not accessible. So now what am I going to do? I mean, weeks of planning that other people just don't do because they drive themselves to the airport, or they take a cab to the airport and they walk in with their luggage and they check in. So I just want us to think about that additional mental and emotional load, and about our responsibility as community members to make sure that we minimize that as much as we can. So that is my soapbox for today. So this is the contact information for the Great Lakes ADA Center. Who is your ADA Center? That's in your neck of the woods. Robin and her team are located in Chicago, and they do a lot of different things for a lot of different people. And they didn't put their contact information on the contact us slide. But it's 800-949-4232. And their website and their email, they do so many great trainings if you are interested in diving deeper into any of these things. Any final questions, Chris?
I'll open up to the floor for anybody. Feel free to raise your hand, or just you can turn on your camera, but I don't see any currently in the chat.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for the opportunity to come talk to you. I hope that this was helpful.
This is fantastic. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. We were supposed to finish at 2, right?
Yeah. This is perfect. Yeah, perfect timing. You nailed it.
Awesome. Good to know. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. You have a great day.
Take care. Thanks.
Bye.